Olá, bom dia.
Hello, good morning.
A minha apresentação é sobre... Tá bom. Sobre metas de inflação.
So our presentation today is on inflation targeting. I'm going to try and argue today with you, saying that this kind of monetary policy that is today considered the state of art in terms of monetary policy is no big news, and it's not effective at that in order to prevent cycles, boom and bust, and credit boom and bust cycles. This presentation intends to cover the definition of inflation targeting, to give you historical examples of monetary performance from some developed countries. We're going to talk about some other historical elements and try to reach some conclusions. In 1971, Nixon defaulted on the Bretton Woods Treaty and severed the link still existing between the US dollar and gold by closing the gold window under which US dollars were redeemable by central banks, in which the Fed enabled other countries to redeem their currencies in parity with gold. Ever since money was introduced in our society, this was the first time in which the world was only left with fiduciary currency and floating currency and floating exchange. The only anchor for currency was a nominal one that should be implemented at the domestic level. At this time, so when Bretton Woods Treaty was uncomplied with, then in 74, the Bundesbank, and in 75, the Swiss Central Bank, and then after that, the Canadian Central Bank, they started stating targets for the expansion of monetary aggregates, trying to indicate to economic agents what the inflation would be to be expected by applying quantitative theory. That was the first effort to create this nominal link with the international monetary system without any ties to gold, however weak this link could be. But central banks never managed to comply with their monetary expansion targets. And so, due to political pressures, they were forced to not comply with them, and this jeopardized their credibility. Only in 1990, New Zealand adopted explicit reference not to expansion of monetary aggregates, but to an aimed price level measured by a price index that inflation targeting policy in a narrow sense officially began with that. In a strict sense. Current chairman of Fed,
ainda na sua posição de acadêmico,
Bernanke,
ele
Mr. Bernanke,
descreveu
described
metas de inflação
inflation
como
targeting
uma estrutura
as a
para a
framework
política
for
monetária
monetary policy
caracterizada pelo anúncio
characterized by the
público de
public
metas
announcement of
quantitativas
official
oficiais
quantitative
ou uma
targets
amplitude de meta desejada
or target
para a taxa de
ranges
inflação
for the inflation
sobre
rate over
ou mais
one or
horizontes de
more
tempo
time
e
horizons,
pelo reconhecimento
and by
de que a inflação
explicit
baixa e
acknowledgement
constante
that
é a
low,
principal
stable
meta
inflation
da
is
política
monetary
monetária a
policy's
longo
primary
prazo.
long-run goal.
Desde os anos 30,
Ever since the 30s,
na tentativa de
trying
classificar diferentes políticas monetárias,
rate different monetary policies.
uma das divisões de categorias que mais se usa é a
One of
divisão
the
entre políticas
major
de
classifications is the
regra,
division between
políticas regradas e
rule-based
políticas
policies
discricionárias.
and discretionary-based
Padrão ouro, por
discretionary
exemplo, é uma
policies.
regra. Quer dizer,
For example, the
ele
gold
estabelece
standard is a
como
rule.
que se pode produzir moeda,
It establishes how you can produce
moeda
currency
mediante a existência de
upon
depósitos de
the
ouro.
existence of gold deposits.
O Bernanke,
Bernanke,
caracterizar
as he characterized inflation rate targets as a framework, he was trying to escape from this categorization. It didn't want to accept the idea of inflation target policies as discretionary, because there are many works showing that as discretionary level increases, then uncertainty also goes up. So that's a way that had been attempted in the past, and he didn't want to get stuck in terms of what the Fed could do. So he said this was not a rule, it's not discretion, this is a framework. That's what he tried to convey in his statement. And the key elements of inflation targeting policies, there are two key elements actually. First is that the central bank has a high level of discretion to use the tools that are available, and it also has a formal commitment to keep low inflation. The first part, there's the idea, the first element shows the strength of the central bank and conveys the idea that the authorities are committed to low inflation. And it shows everything, each bad thing they can do, how mean they can be, let's say. And the second element to keep low inflation would be the justification, so they can do whatever they like. Among the things that the central bank can do in order to influence inflation rate as measured by a price index, and we'll get there pretty soon, they can expand or they can increase or diminish inflation rates, they can change commercial banks, they can change the classes of assets and the conditions under which they're going to give deductions and discounts, they can impose new regulations, they can expand or contract money supply, and this, the advocates of such policies say, create the psychological conditions to actually achieve its aims. It's even possible to practice inflation targeting policies using a rule, Taylor rule, that is a rule for a mobile inflation targeting policy, depending on what the inflation was, is a rule, and many central banks have adopted inflation target policies by applying this rule. And one thing that is important to keep in mind is that Taylor rule
inflation targeting.
is not inflation targeting.
Embaixo do framework do inflation targeting,
below the inflation target framework, among other things, you may try and follow, trying to link the basic interest rate to the recent inflation rates.
O caso é que os defensores dessas políticas
proponents of inflation targeting policies
argumentam que
argue that
não são
rules
uma proteção
are not a protection against changes in monetary policy,
e que mudanças nas circunstâncias,
that changing circumstances requires changes in rules, and that even gold standard is not a guarantee of stability in the production of currency, because a country may leave the gold standard if it needs so, as history has proven so many times.
Que foi feito. Então, as políticas monetárias
so monetary policies
são todas discricionárias.
Are all discretionary to a certain extent.
E alegam os defensores de políticas de meta de inflação.
And the proponents of inflation targeting policies say that the best you can do is to create a nominal link, a nominal anchor that ever since 1990 began to be used in New Zealand.
Vamos chegar aqui em seguida. Então, com diferentes graus de formalidade e de compromisso,
considering the different levels of informality and public commitment, targeting, inflation targeting by authorities then became the common practice. And as I said in the beginning, this is considered the best you can do in terms of monetary policy today. Low levels of inflation that have been historically reached upon inflation targeting seemed to prove this thesis. Ever since inflation targets started being used, then inflation rates started going down, and people thought that's about it. But the beginning of the recent financial crisis challenged this consensus, of which the Austrian countries were never part of, the Austrian school followers. These two slides, what I'd like to call their attention to, I mean, these are price changes, consumer price changes in these countries, the US, Canada, Japan. And what I'd like to call their attention to here is basically 4 periods, different periods. This period from 70 to 73 is a period over which there was still a little bit of the Bretton Woods Treaty